For us college basketball fans, this is a pretty big day, isn't it? I believe Greg and several others will be holding a prayer group for NC State fans uh, on this side of the sanctuary. Nathan and the Duke fans will be on this side in the prayer group. Pastor Mark will be holding a prayer group for Purdue fans and Purdue alumni in his office. And for any Tennessee fans here, you can have the annex. We got you. Okay, all right. Include the state women's. Okay, all right. South Carolina women fan, we'll find a place for you. Okay, but it's a very big day. Don't worry, you'll get home in plenty of time. All right. Now, I went to NC State. Yes, I graduated. Just think of all the jokes and everything. Okay, I graduated. And while I have thoroughly enjoyed watching the Wolfpack play in the NCAAs, the men and women's tournaments, and I've enjoyed watching the men win the conference championship for the first time in 37 years, there is something that I have enjoyed more. And that's reconnecting with some of my oldest and dearest friends, Scott and Chris. Now, before I went to NC State, I was part of the pretty cool group of people at high school. You guessed it, the orchestra, right? We even had the letter jackets, orchestra. Don't mess with us, right? Yeah, don't mess with us. But when I went to NC State, all my friends, we went to different schools, and I was worried about making new friends. But then I met Chris during my first year as we worked together on a school committee. And we hit it off immediately. We had the same interest, and we lived practically in the same town. Me in Winston-Salem, him in Tobaccoville. And Scott was Chris's roommate. By the start of the sophomore year, I hung out with Chris and Scott and their friends a lot. And then I remember, I'm sure it was a Friday night, and all the guys were together. We were going out to eat, and Scott said something. He said, "You know what, Jonathan? You are one of my best friends." And it made me so happy. And that moment, it opened my eyes to the fact that Scott and Chris and our group of about 10 people, I had not just close and best friends, I had a family. And that leads to our gospel lesson. This lesson points us to the story of not only Easter, but to the story of God, the disciples, and us. The relationship between Jesus and the disciples starts in the very first chapter of John. We see the first disciples, Andrew, Peter, Philip, and Nathanael, following this fantastic teacher and preacher named Jesus. Pretty soon, they start to call Jesus Rabbi, which was appropriate since disciples is another word for students. From chapters 2 through 12, the disciples watch as Jesus heals the sick, challenges the religious authority, and invites and includes people who were considered outcasts, especially people who were considered sinners or left behind. And I also want to lift up how he included women in his ministry and in his teachings. People that they're now being a part of this thing called the kingdom. The relationship between the teacher and the disciples was evolving. And then we get to chapter 13, where Jesus shares one last supper with his disciples. But to Jesus, this meal is not shared between teacher and student. At this supper, Jesus said, "You are no longer my students. You are my friends." Think of a time you met someone, and over days, months, maybe years, that person becomes one of your closest friends. Think of that person, that image, that memory, and what went through the disciples' minds. Jesus had taken their relationship up a level. And it would be a great way to end the story. It is a great way to end the supper among friends and pals. But unfortunately, the story does not end there. For even as Peter and Andrew and Philip and Nathanael and the disciples are now calling Jesus friend, they still end up breaking Jesus' heart. One of Jesus' so-called friends, Judas, betrays him to the authorities. Peter betrays Jesus by denying his relationship, even after bragging he would do no such thing. To top it all off, he does it 3 times. And while their teacher, their friend, is nailed to a cross, and he is abused and spat on and scoffed at and laughed at, the disciples are not there standing at the cross defending him. They're not there. They ran away to hide. Some friends, right? When Jesus needed his friends, they were nowhere to be found. How many of us have felt that same sense of loss, hurt, and betrayal by someone that we called a friend? Someone we let enter and become a part of our lives, only to see that person disappoint us when we needed them the most. For many of us, that friendship would be over forever. But then comes Easter, the first day of the week, as our reading begins. The 7-day week was the ancient heritage of several Middle Eastern cultures. The final day of the week was set aside for the Jewish people to praise God for his divine acts of grace. And that day was called the Sabbath, meaning the 7th. It was a time for rest, restoration, and reflection on God's creation, especially the creation accounts from Genesis 1 and 2. As for us Christians, the resurrection was evidence of the renewal of creation. Easter was the beginning of a new era, a new creation story in Jesus Christ. So Christians no longer consider the 7th day the last day, but the first day of the week. So for us, the first day of the week is not just how John begins the resurrection story. It means something more to us. It means this is how the real story begins. And it begins with a talk between friends. Jesus appears before Mary. Mary, a friend, by the way, who did not abandon Jesus. A friend who was there when the going got tough. A friend who was the true first resurrection evangelist. As Mary is weeping, who is there to help her through her confusion and pain? It is Jesus. In verse 13, 2 angels ask Mary why she is weeping. And then it's not the angels who respond to her questions. There is only one who can and does answer, and that is Jesus. When Mary needed to know, there was no one from God's public relations department who responds. It was God himself. While she was weeping, Jesus is right there. And the same voice that said, "Let there be light. Let there be creation." This same voice is the one that says, "Mary." The same voice that brought forth creation brings forth connection. When Jesus appears, alive and well, scars and all, what does this mean to those who turn their backs on him? What will happen to the disciples? What is Jesus going to do to those so-called friends of his? Is he going to track them down and punish them? Is he going to curse them? The answer comes in the verse forged in my heart forever. When Jesus brings up the disciples, the first thing he tells Mary to do is, go and tell my brothers, not my betrayers, not my backstabbers, my brothers. In a moment when Jesus has every right to sever his ties, Jesus takes his relationship with the disciples to a higher level. He has gone from calling them disciples to friends and now family. Not even Maundy Thursday, not even Good Friday, not even death can sever the bond, the love that Jesus has for his family. Jesus shows this love when he appears before the disciples in verses 19 and 20. It's like the scene in our lives when we see that someone who has hurt or betrayed us. And we all have fantasized about that moment. We all have created 3-hour movies of just what we would say to that person. It's the big uh-oh moment for the disciples. And you wonder what you will say or do. This is that scene. This is that moment. This is the time when Jesus can let them have it. And he does let them have it. He lets them have peace. At that moment, Jesus gives them what he gives all of us: peace, forgiveness, love. This is our God in a nutshell. This is our God, the God we are here to worship. For those of you who are new to this place, this is the God we worship and talk about and follow each and every week. Even after the disciples turned their backs on Jesus, even after the disciples had lost their kingdom privileges, Jesus does not push them away. Jesus draws them closer. And that is what God does when God forgives. God draws us closer. That is what God does for God's family. The relationship, the bond between God, our Father, and God's family is something God has taken seriously from the beginning of creation. When Adam and Eve eat the apple, disobeying God in the process, God sends them out of the garden, but what does God do? God provides clothes for them. When Cain murders his brother Abel and God sends him out, what does God do? He puts a sign on Cain, a mark that lets others know that Cain is still under God's protection. When humankind turns to sin and God is ready to wash them all away in a great flood, what does God do? God makes Noah and his family the start of a new beginning. When people try to build a tower that reaches the heavens so that they can be like God, and then God scatters them with different languages, what does God do? God sends out Abraham to bring them back. When the people become slaves in Egypt, what does God do? God remembers his covenant and sends Moses to free the people. Throughout the story of our faith, throughout the story of our family, God never leaves his children behind. Jesus never leaves his brothers and sisters behind. And again, if you are new to this place, this is something you may never have heard, God has never left you behind. God is with you every single place you are. God has never stopped loving you. No matter who tells you otherwise, they are wrong. God's love for you is eternal. Even if it means second chance after second chance, third chance, fourth chance. Pick a number, folks, any chance. Jesus did not die for the sake of followers. He died for the sake of his family. Today, for me, for you, today is all about family. It is all about friends. It is all about what Jesus went through to show us how much he loves us. By offering peace instead of punishment, by offering a place at the table instead of a place outside his reach, by providing his arms to hold us instead of pushing us away, and by calling us his children. And not even death could take us away from him, because he is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia.